Hey listeners, just an FYI, today we're going to be talking about depression and everything that goes along with that. So listener discretion is advised. And with that, on to the show. Welcome back everyone to Meditations by Gregory T, Obert, bringing you the best new guided meditations and mental health conversations every week. I'm your host, clinical psychologist Dr. Gregory T, Obert. Thank you so much for joining me today on this special episode where I will be talking about depression. And if that's not an uplifting way to start an episode, I don't know what is. So for those of you that are new here, every other week I am doing a special topic on mental health to celebrate the opening of my brand new private practice, Royal Oasis Psychotherapy Institute. Listen, you deserve the best when it comes to mental health treatment, so why not get the best? I now have a fully operational battle station. No, not Star Wars, but I have a fully operational private practice that I am able to use and see people in 43 states by my last count. So you don't even have to be in the same state as me, and I can still see you thanks to a whole bunch of people working behind the scenes to make such legislation possible. So listen, if you find yourself struggling with any kind of mental health condition, be it depression, anxiety, any trauma, PTSD, if you're a veteran and you have some veterans issues that you'd like to discuss, I am your guy. So check out my practice, Royal Oasis Psychotherapy Institute today. The link is in the description. It's royaloasispi.com. See what my services are all about, see if I can help you, and then be sure to send a contact form to me. I'd be happy to get you in on my caseload. There's still a couple slots left for my wait list, which I will start to get to on July 20th. So by the time this goes live, that gives you less than 2 weeks. So if you want to sign up and hit the ground running by July 20th, 2025, of course, when I'm recording this, be sure to check out my website, royaloasispi.com, and sign up today. I'm looking forward to working with you very soon. Now, without further ado, let's begin with today's topic. Have you ever found yourself feeling down, really sad, maybe in a space where you're just not quite sure how you got there? Life just doesn't really seem to give you any kind of pleasure or joy, and you're just feeling really stuck. Maybe your appetite's all off. Maybe your sleep is off. Maybe you're even having really dark thoughts around death, maybe even suicide. Well, these could all be signs that you are dealing with a very intense form of sadness called depression. This doesn't make you weird or crazy. It just means that you are dealing with something that many people have dealt with at some point in their lives, and many people have been able to overcome. Now, I want to have a disclaimer on this episode because it seems to me, much like my last guide on trauma, you can listen to that 2 weeks ago, but much like the word trauma, the word depression also tends to be overused. Oh, I'm feeling so depressed. Oh man, life is terrible. I'm depressed. And while this word can be used casually to mean I'm just feeling a little down, like a little sad, that's not really what it means in a clinical context. So when I talk about depression today, I'm talking about an actual clinical medical disorder that I or any other professional trained in mental health diagnoses can give to a patient. So just remember that feeling sad doesn't necessarily mean that you're depressed. Sadness is a perfectly natural, normal emotion. And in fact, if you never felt sad, I would think that either you are lying or maybe you are potentially in some kind of institution because you're a psychopath. You have trouble with emotions. But for most people, feeling sadness is okay. It's healthy, in fact, because emotions, they signal things to us. And I may even do an episode on emotions, generally speaking. So when it comes to sadness, please do not think that feeling sadness, even a heavier sadness, means that you are automatically depressed. It is, as they say, necessary but not sufficient for a diagnosis of depression. So then, what is depression? Well, let me start with a bit of a case study here. This is something that I wrote a number of years back. So this is fake, but it gives the idea of what depression can look like. Miss Jennifer Relog is a 23-year-old woman who schedules an initial appointment in your office. She's been married for about 3 years, has one 2-year-old son with another due in 3 months. She finished college 1 year ago with a degree in marketing and has been with her current job for the past 11 months. Ms. Relog reports that she contacted you after some urging by her husband, who suggested that she was not acting like herself. At first, she reports that she is fine and says that she's just tired a lot. She says she does not know why this is, as she believes she's getting enough sleep every night, minus some early morning awakenings by her son. Eventually, she admits that she has a negative mood most of the day when she is at work and when she's at home. Although she insists that she loves her family and that they are the most important thing in the world to her, she tears up when discussing playtime with them. She states that she is not able to find pleasure in the activities they do the way she once did, and is concerned that she is not a good mother or wife. So when you think about a woman like this, there are a number of signs here suggesting that she's not dealing with just sadness. Sadness can come and go. Maybe it stays for a day, a week. Maybe it stays for an hour. This is something that has been going on for a long time, chronically. Now, one thing I didn't mention in this particular vignette that I wrote would be time frame. Thinking about a woman like this, she's probably been feeling these symptoms, these emotions, these thoughts she's been thinking, these behaviors that have been occurring, and I'll point all these out in more detail in a moment, for a while. And here's the thing. Previous studies that I've taken a look at, previous stats on the main disorder for depression, which is called major depressive disorder. This is the classic one. There are other depressive disorders, but this is the one that I'm really going to be focusing on for this podcast episode. So if you hear me say depression, I'm going to be referring to major depressive disorder. I may even abbreviate it to MDD. I will specify if I'm talking about another depressive disorder, but you can autocorrect to MDD. Previous studies I've looked at and stats I've looked at, in the U.S., there's about a 7% prevalence rate of depression over a 12-month period. So that's a significant portion of the population. It's 3 times higher in 18 to 29-year-olds than in individuals who are age 60 or older. And women tend to experience MDD at 1.5 to 3 times higher rates than males. And this starts in adolescence. Now, why do I bring all of this up? Well, because I want to highlight just how prevalent depression is. It's not something that affects, 2 people. I mean, you can look at the DSM and find all sorts of disorders that are going to affect the vast minority of people. And again, 7% prevalence rate, that's of course not the majority. That being said, if somebody is going to be experiencing some kind of mental distress, it is most likely going to be somewhere in the realm of depression or anxiety. And again, this week we're going to be focusing on depression. So, what are some things that I, as a healthcare professional, tend to look for when I am going to be diagnosing somebody with major depressive disorder? Well, I'm going to need a majority of the following 9 bits of criteria. And again, these are coming from the DSM-5, or the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So this is the Bible of all mental health disorders in the U.S. I know other places use the ICD, but typically for diagnostic purposes in the United States, you're going to look at the DSM. It's called 5 because we're on the 5th edition, and technically we're on the DSM-5 TR, which is the 5th edition with some text revision, but maybe you don't care about that. Get on with the criteria, Greg. So these are the 9 things that I'm looking for. Depressed mood most of the day, nearly every day. Now keep that in mind, right? Most of the day. So I'm going to interpret that as a majority of your waking hours. So if I'm just going to, generalize here and say you get 8 hours of sleep, of the 16 hours that you are awake, are you depressed 8+ hours of the day? And you got to think nearly every day. So I would interpret that as minimum 4 days out of the week. The criteria says nearly every day, but sometimes with depression, it doesn't necessarily look like that with everybody. Sometimes people can still be depressed and not have it nearly every day, but can have it a majority of the time. And that's okay as far as diagnostic purposes. Because again, nearly every day is, you can interpret that to be 6-7 days out of the week, 5 days out of the week. Again, I would say at least 4. You also need to be looking for a clinical term called anhedonia. And you can think about this as markedly diminished interest. Did I trip over my words there? Markedly diminished interest, there we go, or pleasure in all or almost all activities most of the day, nearly every day. So you can think about this as anything that used to bring you pleasure, whether it's in Miss Relog's case, playtime with family, maybe it's a hobby of yours, maybe it's talking with friends, whatever the case may be, anything that used to bring you pleasure just doesn't really do that anymore. It's almost like you have to go through the motions just to get through that task, and even then, there's a whole bunch of why bother that comes from that. Then that would be a sign of anhedonia. Next up is significant weight loss or weight gain when you're not trying to do either. So this could be, the rule of thumb in the DSM is a change of more than 5% of body weight in a month. So if you're not dieting, you're not trying to lose weight, you're not trying to gain weight, you just happen to do so, and it's a significant amount, okay, well that could be a sign of depression. And when you think about this, why is that? Why would weight change be something that's a sign of depression? If you've ever been depressed, or you know someone who's been depressed, think about their relationship with food. Some people, when they're depressed, they don't want to eat anything at all, even though they know they probably could eat something. They just don't. There's no appetite there. And so they're going to lose weight as a result of that. The opposite is also true. Think about people who eat their feelings, who have a really unhealthy relationship with food. They're going to feel depressed and then seek comfort in eating. And it's probably going to be unhealthy stuff. They're not going to be eating, celery or something healthy. It's probably going to be cookies, cake, chips, all that delicious stuff that is unhealthy for us when we eat it outside of moderation. So that weight change is one of the signs of depression. Next up is insomnia or hypersomnia nearly every day. So insomnia is something that most people understand. You just can't go to sleep no matter how hard you try. Hypersomnia is the opposite. You can sleep 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 hours, and you wake up and you're still exhausted. You're still tired. You're sleeping most of the day. Both of those things can be signs of depression. The next criteria is what they call psychomotor agitation or retardation, nearly every day. What the heck does that mean? Well, for those of you that have seen Zootopia, I thought it was just an okay movie. I've only seen it once. I thought it was an okay movie. But think about the best scene in that movie is when they go to the DMV and everyone working there is a sloth. And they move so slow. It's a great scene. If you haven't seen the movie, just look up on YouTube the DMV scene from Zootopia, because again, that's the best scene in the whole movie. But they move really, really slow. And so you think about someone who's depressed, they're probably going to be moving a lot slower than the average person. Not to the point of the sloths in Zootopia, but they're just kind of sluggish. They're just not really, perky, quick to do things. They're just really slow. Now, the psychomotor agitation would be the opposite. You think about someone who's, really amped up, keyed up, kind of jittery, jumping all over the place, can't really sit still. Of course, that can be related to other types of conditions too, like anxiety. It can also be related to depression. Next up is going to be fatigue or loss of energy nearly every day. People who tend to be depressed experience this. Pretty straightforward. You're just tired. You just don't really have the energy to do whatever it is that you want to do. Next up are going to be feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt nearly every day. So people who are feeling depressed often think they're worthless. They usually feel guilty. They'll feel like a burden, and they'll feel like everything is their fault. And that's just not necessarily the case. It could be. People do things that, sometimes it is their fault. But again, keep in mind here, excessive and inappropriate guilt. It's my fault that everything's going poorly. Because of my mood, everyone around me is suffering. And if I could just get my life together, I wouldn't be such a burden, and I'm just such a worthless POS, so to speak. Piece of S. Sorry to use harsh letters, but you get the idea. And if you've ever been depressed or someone around you's been depressed, you know that it is very difficult to shake them out of that. And in fact, I would argue that you can't do that. It's something that they have to work through themselves. Next up is going to be a diminished ability to think, concentrate, and or indecisiveness nearly every day. So again, thinking about someone who's experiencing intense, severe sadness, that's really at the heart of depression. These people aren't going to be able to think or focus clearly. They might be able to. Someone with depression might be able to do that. It just takes a lot of effort. It's very difficult to sit and focus. And this difficulty with concentration, it could be related to any number of topics. It could be reading a book. It could be watching a movie, watching a TV show. It could be a conversation. Whatever the case may be, concentration in general, a diminished ability to think, to focus, and again, even indecision, those can be signs of depression. Keep in mind, nearly every day. So minimum, in my mind, of 4 days a week. Last piece of criteria is a little dark, but it's also true when it comes to depression, and that's recurrent thoughts of death or recurrent suicidal ideation. That could include how you'd kill yourself. It could include an actual suicide attempt, chronic suicidal thinking, what it would look like if, I killed myself. Now, I also want to separate that from the first part of this criteria, which is recurrent thoughts of death. Sometimes I'll experience people who are depressed who will be thinking about death, but not necessarily of killing themselves, right? This could be related to, well, I'm just wondering what it might be like if I wasn't here, right? Or I just wish I could go to sleep and not wake up. That's not necessarily thinking, okay, well, I want to kill myself now. So keep in mind that this is a very subtle distinction, yet it's also one that's important for therapists to make. And that's because you want to get a sense of the type of risk you're dealing with someone who might be depressed. Because someone who has chronic thoughts of killing themselves, well, that's a higher risk compared to someone who's just kind of thinking, man, it'd be great if I could just run away, or if I just didn't wake up and I didn't have to deal with this stuff. So those are the 9 main criteria that I'm looking for when I am going to diagnose someone with major depressive disorder. All of these symptoms, or whichever ones apply to the person, have to be present for at least the last 2 weeks. Of course, oftentimes, I honestly don't think I've ever seen, now that I think about it, someone who's only had these symptoms for the last 2 weeks. Typically, by the time I see somebody, it's been going on for a lot longer than that. Now, the other thing that I need to make sure that I'm screening for, and any therapist worth their weight is screening for, are sort of some extra bits that the DSM also specifies. Clinically significant distress or impairment in various domains of functioning, like social, occupational, academic, whatever important domains are currently present for the person, because academic doesn't apply to everyone in their lives. And this is important, right? Because if someone is dealing with all of this, all of these 9 symptoms that I mentioned, but then they're going to come in and say, well, it's not really causing me any impairment. It's not really causing me any significant distress. Well, then I can't really diagnose this particular disorder. Let's be real. By the time someone's coming to see me, they already know, hey, I'm in some kind of clinically significant distress, or I have impairment, or I have impairment in some kind of important domain or domains of my life. It's also important for me to screen for any kind of substance use, because if someone is actively using substances, well, I can't necessarily distinguish between what is caused by the drug and what is actually depression. To give you an example of this, it's not exactly depression, but it kind of proves the point. I've done a few screenings in the past where I'm doing PTSD screenings. Essentially, it's for trauma. And a person will come and they'll tell me about this horrific thing where they've heard people being tortured and they've heard, these horrible stories or sounds in their apartments, and they've seen people, carrying bodies out in body bags, and it must have been the mob or there must have been some cult. And then when I start to ask about substance use, oh yeah, I was actively using, meth or heroin or whatever at the time. Well, I'm not saying those things didn't happen, because of course somebody could be using substances and see these terrible things, and PTSD could be there. But I also can't cleanly distinguish PTSD because the substances were involved. And the same is true here, because if someone is telling me, well, I'm using a lot of cocaine, and those lows when I'm coming down from the high, I feel really bad, I feel really down, Absolutely, I'm having trouble sleeping, and I take, little interest or pleasure in things that used to bring me pleasure. Again, that could be depression. In fact, substance use often accompanies depression, to try and cover up those sad feelings. But of course, we also know that the after effects of using cocaine might mirror, not might, they can mirror, they do mirror some of the symptoms that I'm looking for in major depressive disorder. So unless I can cleanly say, look, what's happening here is not related to substance use, then I can't really diagnose someone ethically with major depressive disorder. You also have to screen for any kind of medical conditions. As an example of this, if you have an underactive thyroid, right, hypothyroidism, this can have similar effects on somebody's presentation. So it could be that depressed mood, it could be the fatigue, it could be the weight gain. Right? So I need to make sure that there is no medical condition that might be contributing to the symptoms of depression that I'm seeing in front of me. And finally, I also need to take a look at if there is another mental health condition that better fits as opposed to major depressive disorder. An example of this would be if someone's ever had a manic or a hypomanic episode. Well, I'm looking at bipolar disorder. I'm not looking at major depressive disorder. So, as you can tell, I'm screening for a lot of things. And this is partially why when you go to see a therapist, they're asking you about all of this stuff. Right? Some of it is just a general history to get a sense of who you are. And also some of it is I need to make sure that you don't have XYZ so that when we do start talking about your mental health symptoms in the intake, I can properly diagnose you and say, yes, this is major depressive disorder, as opposed to, actually, this might be a medical condition because the person talked about, well, they haven't had a physical in a while and they've previously had thyroid issues in the past, underactive thyroid, and they haven't been taking their medication for that. Okay, well, again, it could be depression, but we got to make sure that it's not a medical condition. Now, as I mentioned earlier, major depressive disorder can be seen alongside of other mental health disorders. They call them comorbid disorders. Right? The most common one that you're going to see is depression and anxiety. I will often say to my clients, they're holding hands. It's like they're dating. From one of the sources that I found, this was a 2018 source, anxiety disorders co-occur with major depressive disorder about 59% of the time. So it is a minority of the cases that I see where anxiety does not play a part in any kind of depressive disorder, or in this case, major depressive disorder. So what do we do about all this? I mean, it's a lot of heaviness, right? Depression is very heavy, and so how do we address this within the therapeutic relationship? Well, there's a number of things that we're going to be doing, and of course, the first thing is the diagnostic piece. Right? I got to figure out and see if this is purely depression. If this is depression with some other co-occurring disorder, or if this is depression that's not really depression because it's being caused by something else. So you're going to go through an intake process. I would give you a whole bunch of different screeners. And again, any therapist worth their weight is going to do the exact same thing. They're going to give you a whole bunch of screeners to get a sense of what your symptoms are. They're going to get a general history. And you're going to spend the first session telling them about your life story. And not in a ton of detail, right? You're just going to go in and get just just enough so they have a sense of what's going on with you. Once this is done, and it turns out, yep, you do have major depressive disorder, and we can start working on how to treat this, then all of your subsequent sessions are going to be focused on that, as well as any other goals you might have. There might be some other things you want to touch on, like maybe communication, maybe boundary setting, and that's fine. If your goal is just to work on the depression, then you're going to be focused on that in your therapy sessions. Now, therapy, as I've mentioned previously, is not an eternal process. At least any therapist worth their weight would tell you that. I know there's memes going around online, and I laugh every time I see them too, where, okay, therapists get excited when they see someone walk in the door with, they're crying and they have all these tattoos and they say, I have all these problems. And okay, great. I'm going to have this person in my office for the next 20 years and that's guaranteed income. Well, yeah, I get it. It's funny. Also, that's not what a good therapist is going to do. A good therapist is going to give you a sense of how long the treatment might take, and it depends on the person. It might be a few weeks, it might be a few months, it might be a few years. It depends. However, at some point, there should be a termination process. I don't know why they call it that in mental health, because it sounds like, Arnold is going to pop out of your closet and just destroy you. But the termination process is just ending the treatment, being done, closing the case. It could, of course, be opened up in the future, but this round of treatment is going to be over. And I think that's actually really helpful for people, because a lot of times they don't always get that when they go to therapy. It just seems like they're supposed to go forever, and that's not the case. I tell my clients that if you are going to the doctor for the flu and they give you medicine for that flu, and a year from now they are still prescribing you the same medicine for the same flu, well, then they haven't done their jobs, because they're either not treating the flu properly, or which is more likely the case, they're just completely negligent. It doesn't take a year to get rid of the flu, generally speaking. I mean, I've never heard of a case where a flu lasts longer than a year. Maybe there's some obscure case, but in general, that just doesn't happen. And the same is true here. When it comes to treating depression, yes, different people move at different paces, and it might take a year. It also doesn't mean that you got to be in therapy for the next decade, the next 5 years, the next 2 years. Even the next year, it might not even take a year. It just depends on the person. And when I say it depends on the person, what I mean by that is it depends on their willingness to do the work. It depends on their personality, right? Some people are just slower movers than others. They have more baggage to sort through. And that's okay. It doesn't make someone better or worse if they have, less baggage. Oh, they're better, right? It's just different. And sometimes we have setbacks as we go through treatment. Sometimes I'll work with people and things are going really well, and some big metaphorical bomb will be dropped into their laps, and we got to take some time to work on that. And maybe some old habits, old patterns come back. But that doesn't mean that everything is completely derailed, and again, then they have to stay in therapy for the next 10 years. That's just not the case. So then, what does treatment look like? Well, that's going to depend on the theoretical orientation of the therapist that you're seeing, because different theoretical orientations are going to treat depression differently. Now, when it comes to my expertise, my wheelhouse, I tend to follow 2 different theoretical orientations, yet I still think they're very much related. Even though there are differences, I still think they're very much related. And those 2 theoretical orientations are going to be cognitive behavioral therapy and client-centered therapy. So just to kind of give you an idea here of what Aaron Beck, who was the founder of cognitive therapy, which later kind of got rolled into behavioral therapy and hence CBT. And he died recently. He was in his 90s, if I remember correctly. Like, dude lived for a long time, so R.I.P. Dr. Beck. But what he talked about is that, in short, and I'm simplifying this, but just, for the sake of the podcast, in short, when we are healthy, we tend to have really healthy thought patterns. Our conceptualizations of the world, really what he called schemas, right? These are constructions of how we think the world is, and just what we think when it comes to moving through the world. Now, these schemas develop in response to the environment, how we're raised, the nurture, right? Not just, that's the debate in psychology. How much of what we do is nature, our biology, and how much is nurture, how we're raised. So Beck would have argued that schemas develop as a result of the environment that you're in. And of course, healthy schemas are going to be indicative of what he called cognitive flexibility, right? So I can have a schema, a belief, I'm worthy. Now, they're going to view the world through this lens, and they're likely going to try to find some kind of what they call behavioral reinforcement that confirms this conclusion. I'm going to look for signs in my environment that I am worthy. However, I'm also flexible enough to know that there are limitations to this schema. So an example of this might be, I recognize that I just got a raise, I'm worthy of this raise and this very large paycheck. However, I'm also recognizing that I'm not worthy of playing in the NBA because that's not going to end well for me, this hypothetical person, and me, Dr. Greg. That would not end well for me. And so schemas, they're not always active, but they can become active pretty easily with certain stimuli, including stressors in our environment. Now, when it comes to depression, and this is what Beck was probably most famous for, is his theory on depression, is that we tend to have rigid schemas. Our thought patterns are going to be inflexible. And each person out there in the world, we all have our own individual set of vulnerabilities and sensitivities that are going to predispose us to some kind of psychological distress. And we all know this to be true on some level. I mean, as an example, in my personal life, for those of you that have seen my lovely wife, Lady Donna, if you haven't, you can check us out on The Game Oberts, which is our YouTube channel where we play games. She is very much into making sure there's a plan for the next meal because she loves her food and she wants to make sure that meal times are set. I, on the other hand, am the type of person who just completely forgets to eat. I'll get wrapped up in some kind of project, look at the clock and go, oh, wow, it's been a while. Maybe I should probably stop what I'm doing and, go eat. When it comes to not having a plan for a meal, that doesn't really affect me at all. But for my wife, she can start to get a little bit anxious about that. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just her particular, vulnerability or sensitivity. In the past, I've had my own vulnerabilities or sensitivities. Particularly when I was younger, money was one of those things. Any kind of big expense, that was a trigger for me to start to get anxious and worry. And you you do have your own, whatever those are. And so figuring out what those predispositions are, those sensitivities, those vulnerabilities can help you when it comes to preventing any sort of rigid schemas from developing in the future. But for this hypothetical, you're not quite there yet. Something has happened in your life and your schemas start to get rigid. One way that I explain this to my clients to just kind of simplify this is, you're living your life, and we all have some kind of tolerance for stress, right? And at some point, we start to get overwhelmed. The image is, the cup overflows. People can pour all their stuff into the cup, but eventually the cup is going to overflow. And it's at that point that we start to have those rigid schemas. And stress, the way I define it is, it's when demands outweigh resources. So if I have a particular sensitivity or vulnerability, and there's a demand that's hitting me right there in that pain point, well, I'm going to develop stress because my resources aren't as built up in that particular area. So what happens when that occurs? Well, our perceptions, our interpretations of life, of ourselves, of other people, of events, it's all going to change. And it's all going to start to turn to this inaccurate way of thinking about such things. So, as an example, going back to this schema of I'm worthy, I'm going to connect this back to Miss Relog, who was the example I gave at the beginning of this episode. Let's say she has a particularly bad work experience. This is going to alter the entirety of the schema around worthiness because she's going to be thinking inaccurately. So, I got a poor performance review, so therefore I'm not worthy of anything good. Now, that's a little extreme, to say, okay, well, you got a bad performance review. That doesn't mean you're not worthy of anything good. But also, this is how depressed people tend to think. And then she's likely to blame herself for all the negative things in her life. And she's going to seek out that evidence to confirm the theory about herself, right? To confirm that schema. An example could be, well, the grocery store was out of my favorite ice cream, so of course they are, since I'm not worthy of anything good. And so it becomes this self-reinforcing cycle. So the 3 themes of depression from Beck's point of view. Events in your life are going to be interpreted negatively. Depressed individuals don't like themselves. And the future is thought of in a negative way. When this happens over and over and over again, we start to have erroneous thinking, what Beck called cognitive distortions. These are going to be systemic errors in reasoning. And there's a number of these that he was able to identify, and ones that I go into, around session 3, 4, 5 with people. And they come up a number of times even after that, because sometimes they get reactivated and we have to keep challenging them. We don't have to, but if you're in therapy, the idea is that you want to keep challenging such things. So an example of what one might look like would be catastrophizing. Right, so this is believing that the worst case scenario is going to happen. I got an F on my test. I am a failure. I'm going to fail out of school. Well, that's not necessarily the case. That's a pretty extreme way of thinking. Or I made a scheduling error. I'm going to get fired and lose my income. Okay, people make scheduling errors at work all the time. It doesn't mean you're going to get fired and lose everything. But that is, of course, catastrophizing, and something that I would look for when I'm treating someone with depression. So I would work with a client to identify what specific thoughts and patterns, themes, cognitive distortions, schemas keep coming up again and again and again. And then we're going to start to explore those a little bit. What do you mean by you're not worthy? What do you mean that everything bad happens to you? And by exploring these thoughts, we're better able to tweak them. And thinking too, when we tweak our thoughts, that's also going to impact how we feel about things and how we behave. Our actions are going to change as a result of our thinking, because if I think I'm not worthy of anything, good, right, then I'm probably not going to go enjoy life. But if I start to think to myself, maybe I am worthy of good things, well, then I'm probably going to go out and start to enjoy life a little bit more. That's going to make me feel better. So this is going to be a major part of treatment when it comes to the CBT side of things. Now, when it comes to the client-centered side of things, Rogers would say that depression is the result of incongruence. In other words, how I feel about myself, how I perceive myself, doesn't line up with the external world. Now, sometimes it's what you would think, the typical way that you think about this would be, I think of myself better, right? I'm great, but then the external world doesn't validate that. And so there's incongruence there. But it could be the other way around too. Maybe the external world gives you a lot of things that you're looking for, but the internal just doesn't feel worthy. And he would argue that you have what are called conditions of worth. These are expectations placed upon you that you have to meet in order to be considered good or acceptable. Now, the way that you can identify these and work through them, thereby reducing your incongruence between who you see yourself as and how you move through the world, would be by sitting in a therapist's office and experiencing the following 3 things. And spoiler alert, he would say this for basically every kind of mental health disorder out there. Empathy, having a therapist understand exactly what you're going through, or at least as close to what you're going through as possible. Congruence, seeing a therapist have a consistent internal state that matches the external state. It's going to be a great model for the other person. And then unconditional positive regard. People have previously said that, it's kind of like love. In a way, it sort of is. It's kind of a genuine care, regard for the person in front of you. Now, I may not agree with anything that you're saying to me. And I also view you as a person worthy of, worth. You're valuable. And I treasure that and I cherish that and I see the humanity in you. And by providing that environment, it helps the person move through whatever it is that's blocking them from achieving what Rogers would call self-actualization, or achieving that peak state for one's own life. So when I blend these 2 different treatments together, what I find is that not only are we able to identify expectations that people maybe place on themselves, thoughts that are inaccurate that we can work through, it also gives the person an opportunity to just experience themselves for an hour with someone who is purely focused on them. Because I say this a lot, and I've probably said it in past episodes. Think about in your life the last time you had somebody, whether it was a friend or a family member, that spent an hour with you, and they were solely and completely focused on you. They wanted you to explore who you are, to speak your mind without fear of what or how that might be received. And they weren't going to insert themselves into the conversation. They weren't going to derail it. It was going to be solely on you. The spotlight is going to be solely on you. Now, maybe you're someone who has that in your life, in which case, hey, congratulations, that is wonderful. For most people, they're going to say, yeah, right. They probably laugh. You probably laughed, if you don't have this in your life, when I was saying that. Yeah, right. The last time someone took a genuine interest in me for a whole hour and didn't try to, put themselves into the conversation, that hasn't happened in God knows how long. So to have that experience once a week is invaluable for many people. And let me tell you, as someone who's been doing this for more than 15 years, it takes a lot of practice to be able to hold that space in that specific way that Roger has recommended for clients. The last thing I want to touch on would be maybe some more specific examples of techniques that might come up in a therapy session that is based on cognitive behavioral therapy with a mix of client-centered therapy or not. But one of the treatments or techniques that you'll probably see a lot of is cognitive rehearsal. With this particular technique, a therapist might ask a patient to picture or imagine them accomplishing a particular task, step by step. So this is useful for people who maybe have difficulty carrying out tasks that require successive steps for its completion. You'll probably engage in what's called cognitive reframing, right, where you will say something that a therapist might challenge, and we're going to start to look at, well, how come that thought is the first thing that pops up? An example of this that I mentioned earlier with catastrophizing. Nothing goes my way. Everything is terrible. I never have any luck with anything. Well, is it true that you never have any luck with anything? That's that rigidity coming out of someone's thinking, the inaccurate thinking. So if we can start to make the thinking a bit more accurate, well, maybe there are some things I have luck in and other things, I have a little bit of trouble with. That's going to help somebody feel better. Because again, if I think I'm not good at anything or nothing ever goes my way in any particular domain of my life, well, that's going to feel pretty heavy. But if I start to think, well, actually some things do feel good and work out for me in certain domains, and in other domains, maybe I need a little bit of work or to, think through those a little bit more, that's going to help somebody feel better. Another technique that you're likely to encounter is what's called a thought log. So some people like to do this outside of sessions. I usually assign it at least once to see, what someone comes up with. Not everyone always does it, but I still encourage it. Pick at least one task a day, one event, and get a sense of what it is that you thought. So a lot of times we're not aware of the thought that comes up. We're more so aware of the feeling, the emotion. And if we can sort of backtrack, right? Okay, well, this thing happened at work. I felt this, but what was the emotion what was the thought that was in between the event and the emotion? What was I telling myself? And then after I felt the emotion, what was my behavior? How did I react? That's going to start to show us some patterns that are going on with you. And when we see the patterns, we can start to change the schema. And these are just a few of the techniques you might experience. Again, there might be some other techniques pulled in from other strains of psychotherapy. But in general, if you're dealing with a purist CBT practitioner, that's what you're going to see. I find that my particular blend of CBT and client-centered therapy helps people out more quickly, and I think it results in longer-lasting change, deeper change, than someone who's just doing a purist form of CBT. I also recognize that some people may want a different style of psychotherapy. Some people may prefer a more psychodynamic approach, which is more in line with Freud, or a Gestalt approach. Whatever the case may be, there are benefits to doing other types of psychotherapies for depression. But again, this is what's going to be most common out there. That purist cognitive behavioral therapy, and of course, a bit biased, but the cut above is going to be the CBT mixed with client-centered therapy. So this is a general overview of depression, what someone's going to be looking for when they're diagnosing it, as well as what a treatment might look like for depression. If you have any concerns from what you heard today, like, oh man, a lot of that does sound like me, I really encourage you, whether it's to me, whether it's to somebody else, please reach out for professional help, because there are people out there that want you to succeed. They want you to be happy and to thrive. And you can't have that if you don't reach out. And so that first step is, of course, it's a tough one, yet it's one that can be life-changing. If what you've heard today isn't necessarily you, but it is somebody that you know in your life, please do share this episode with them. Encourage them to listen to it. We can't force them to, of course, but hopefully they'll take a moment, an hour, and listen to this and know that, what they're experiencing isn't weird or strange. It is normal for someone who's experiencing depression, and there is help out there for them. So please do share this where you think it'd be most useful. Of course, if you enjoy what I do here, please leave a 5-star rating and review. It is always helpful for making the show grow, helping the show to grow. And especially if you're listening on Spotify. I've been told that I have very few ratings and reviews there, so I would definitely appreciate it. Of course, though, if you're listening on Apple or anywhere else, any 5-star ratings, reviews, shares are most welcome, and I thank each and every one of you for doing that. It really warms my heart to know that what I have to say is useful for people and that it's reaching the people who need to hear it the most. So again, I am clinical psychologist Dr. Gregory T. Obert. If you are interested in receiving premium elite psychotherapy, check out my practice, the Royal Oasis Psychotherapy Institute, royaloasispi.com. Check it out. Send me a completed contact form if you want to get onto one of my limited spaces for psychotherapy. And again, I'm going to start working on that particular wait list on July 20th. So be sure to secure your spot today. For those interested in the next guided meditation, that will be next week. So I look forward to releasing that then. But until next time, thank you so much for allowing me to walk with you on your healing journey. Be safe, be well, be powerful.